Welcome to the Rap Soul Podcast, where we dive deep into the world of music that moves our hearts and gets our feet tapping. This is the intersection of rap and soul music from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. We appreciate you for listening. Share this podcast with a friend or family member who loves music as much as you do. The podcast is hosted by 12 Kyle. Next up, the Rap Soul Podcast.
Leading up to 1987, rap rhymes were very simple. The schemes were very simple, not complex at all. And that is, you could hear and see that in the rappers that we had at that particular time. When you think about rappers like LL or Melly Mel from that particular time of rap. But in the summer of 87, everything changed. That summer, Rakim and his DJ Eric B would release Paid in Full as their debut album. And this album was unlike anything else that we had heard before at that particular time. And I maintain that it is the greatest hip hop album ever. Welcome to another edition of the Rap Soul Podcast. I am your boy 12 Kyle. I want to thank you all for tuning in as you do each and every week. Again, this is the Rap Soul Podcast. This is the intersection where we have discussion about music and artists from the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s when it comes to rap, hip hop, soul, and R&B. Simply put, folks, this is the best music podcast that you have never heard of until right now. Again, I want to thank you all for tuning in. Shout out to those of you who are watching on YouTube as well as Spotify. Check this out. All right, so if you've been following the podcast, you know that we've been counting down the best years in hip hop. We're starting at number 12. And on this episode, we travel to number 11, the year 1987. And listen, as someone who was outside in 1987, this year was incredible when it comes to hip hop. And what I've thought about and what I've learned is that in doing these episodes, it takes me back because at the time that 1987 arrives and most of these albums arrive, I was a mere 14 years old. I would turn 15 in December, but I was really, really falling in love with the genre of rap. It wasn't even called hip hop at the time. It was simply rap. And a lot of great music came out in that time. And as I look at the list of albums that came out, much to my surprise, I purchased most of them. I don't really remember how I did it, but I got it. And, you know, I didn't have a lot of money. And I think my allowance was, I think it was $15, I think. But it wasn't a lot of money back then in 87. But just looking at it, it makes me reflect back on a time where music was really dope, and the artists that we're going to talk about that came out that year or that released albums that year were some really, really dope artists. So in this episode, as we will on every episode that we do this breakdown, we'll talk about some of the breakout stars. We'll also talk about the rappers who were at their apex in 1987. We'll talk about some essential albums in 1987. And last but not least, we'll talk about the certified classics, and we use that term loosely, the certified classics that came out in 1987. So without further ado, let's get to it. I'll say this. A lot of rap experts often cite 1988 as the year that changed hip-hop forever. And I will concur. But if we're being honest, the revolution of rap music and then subsequently hip-hop music actually started a year earlier in 1987. I can make the case that 1987 at the time was the most innovative year in rap history and subsequently in hip-hop history. It really was the first time that the genre of music started to look, listen, and feel as it does today. And there were a lot of contributing factors. But I want to talk first about some of the people that I would call the breakout stars in 1987. 1987 was a breakout year for a guy coming out of Oakland, California, none other than Todd Shaw, aka Too Short. Too Short, man, really came to me by a surprise. I want to say my homeboy Jay Fresh, who you guys, you've never met Jay Fresh, but you're going to hear me reference Jay Fresh in a lot of these episodes because he and I both dove into rap music at the same time with so much love and vigor for, what we were discovering. But I want to say Fresh found a Too Short tape, and I remember him playing it for me, and I was like, who is this dude? And the thing that stood out to me was, as we listened to the album's called Born to Mac, the song on there by the name of Freaky Tales. And I think for me, that was the first time that I heard somebody from the West Coast kind of break it down like that and then talk dirty, but it was still cool. It was still smooth. It was still something that we gravitated to. And I liked Too Short from the beginning, and I quickly became a fan. I think 1987 most definitely was a breakout year for him. Again, at that particular time, at least to my knowledge, there were not a lot of rappers coming from the West. And even more specific, I don't really recall a lot of rappers coming from Oakland either. And so he had a couple of things going against him per se, because at this particular time, New York in particular was the center of rap. We didn't have, and it's not to say that rap didn't exist in different regions, because in 1987, rap music was very much regional, just like any other thing was. But as the genre grew, stars grew. And subsequently, we got a star coming out of Oakland, California by the name of Too Short. And listen, Too Short started back in 87 and is still doing it almost 40 years later to this day. And shout out to Short, man. I don't know how one could invent, then reinvent off the reinvention of himself. And he's definitely showed no signs of slowing down. I'm not even going to tell you how many albums he's put out because I have no idea. It's probably close to 30. But yeah, shout out to the Mac, the legend, Too Short. Another breakout star in 1987 was a guy coming out of Philadelphia by the name of Schoolie D. Now, I'll be honest, I was kind of late on the Schoolie D train, but again, my boy Jay Fresh put me on to PSA, Parkside Killers. For us, Schoolie D was the first to have gangsterisms in his rap music. And it's not to say that he was the first gangster rapper, but he was the first one to have street tales that we heard. And I want to preface that because there's some people who try to make the argument about this guy started it or that guy started. I don't necessarily know who started it. And to be honest, it's kind of hard to say who started it because, again, rap at the time was very regional. So I can't say that Schoolie D wasn't doing it in Philadelphia when, maybe Too Short was doing it in Oakland or Ice-T was doing it in L.A. They all could have been doing it at the same time. The one thing we do know is that they weren't doing it together because nobody operated like that, right? But yeah, Schoolie D was definitely a breakout star in 1987. That music, it just captivated us. I really can't tell you why, but it was different. And, I don't know if we ever made the declaration or had an understanding the fact that he wasn't from New York. Of course, he shouted out his hood and everything like that, shouted out his city. But I think upon listening to him for the first time, honestly, I just assumed he was from New York because he sounded like he was from the North and he didn't have, West Coast accent. And we didn't have a lot of Southern rappers at the time. And, I don't even recall back in 87 seeing a video. He may have had one, but if I saw it, I don't remember it. But yeah, Schoolie D was definitely a breakout star in 1987. And the last breakout star I will say would be none other than the leader of Public Enemy, and that would be my man Chuck D. Chuck D, even to this day, has one of the most distinct voices in hip hop and rap, and always has. And what's interesting was when we were younger, in 1987, I had no idea how old Chuck D was. I think at the time of this recording, Chuck D's in his late 60s. And so Chuck D could have been 35 with a mortgage and 2 kids and a wife. We didn't know. And more importantly, we didn't care. He's one of the few artists that you could listen to him rap without any music. And I think his vocal tone and what he was saying, along with the musical production by the Bomb Squad, really did a great job of meshing together, because the Bomb Squad had a whole bunch of sounds. And sometimes when you're making music, the sounds can drown out the artist. Well, there's no sound that you can make that's going to drown out the great Chuck D. But he most definitely was a breakout star in 1987 as they released their debut album, Yo, Bum Rush the Show. And we'll touch on that in a little bit as well. And those were people that I deemed to be some of the breakout stars. Now, there were rappers at their apex. So the apex rappers in 1987, one was definitely KRS-One. KRS-One, frontman, leader for Boogie Down Productions out of the Boogie Down Bronx, released an album that we'll talk about in a little bit called Criminal Minded in 1987. It was their debut album. But when you heard KRS-One rap, you knew who he was. And he was a relative unknown outside of, I'm assuming, the tri-state area as far as New York is concerned, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. But when I heard him rap, his voice, what he was talking about, was so clear. And I've often said, like, KRS-One is one of the few rappers that we've had in hip hop over the years that you could play his music for your granny and she'd be able to at least understand what it is that he's saying. You know how sometimes you'll listen to a rapper and you may have to listen to a song 2 or 3 times before you kind of get what they're talking about? KRS-One enunciates his words and he speaks so well. There's a famous episode on Questlove's old podcast episode called the podcast is called Questlove Supreme, and it was an interview that he did with Chris Rock, and the interview's probably about this long, and it was probably about 3 hours long. It's hilarious, right? If you ever get time, go check it out. And Chris Rock, he goes into, I think, was this when Top 5 was out? I think it's when his movie Top 5 was out. And he named KRS-One, I think, as one of his top 5 rappers of all time. And he was mimicking KRS-One's voice, and he goes in his own Chris Rock voice. He was rapping like KRS-One. He said, "My raps will destroy you." I can't do it like Chris Rock, but just imagine KRS-One, or at least Chris Rock, trying to imitate KRS-One, saying, "My raps will destroy you." But all jokes aside, KRS-One is a phenomenal MC. In my personal opinion, he's a top 5 MC of all time. I've got him at 4, right? And so that album, I think, and then his story, where he came from, all the things that surrounded that album, and I'll get to it in just a second, definitely made him at the top of the charts. Not necessarily as far as, like, the radio charts or anything like that, but he was high on the food chain as far as rap was concerned at that particular time. KRS-One still is putting out great music, and I want to say KRS-One probably is in his early 60s, and still an incredible orator, an incredible MC, and definitely, one of the class ones from that particular era. Another apex rapper, a rapper that was definitely at their apex, was none other than William Griffin, a.k.a. Rakim, a.k.a. the God MC. Rakim was at the forefront of this movement. Leading up to 1987, rap rhymes were very simple. The schemes were very simple, not complex at all. And that is, you could hear and see that in the rappers that we had at that particular time. When you think about rappers like LL or Melly Mel from that particular time of rap. But in the summer of 87, everything changed. That summer, Rakim and his DJ Eric B would release Paid in Full as their debut album. And this album was unlike anything else that we had heard before at that particular time. And I maintain that it is the greatest hip hop album ever. Ever. But in saying all of that, his rhymes were incredible. His rhymes are to be studied. He was rapping at a level and a pitch that very few were. At that particular time, a lot of rappers were very high pitched. Rakim was very monotone, and his lyrics and the schemes that he used, the rhyme schemes that he used, were very intricate, and it's something that we had never seen up until that point in time in rap, and it changed the game. And for that, Rakim, I think, was at his apex as far as rapping was concerned. And last but not least, probably the biggest rap star at the time in 1987, that would be none other than James Todd Smith, aka LL Cool J. LL was a rock star in 1987. He had already debuted in a movie. He had already released his first album. He would then go on to release his second album, Bad, aka Bigger and Different. We'll talk about that in just a few. But LL was probably, as far as I can remember, the first rapper where the ladies saw him as a sex symbol. There were girls, young ladies who saw LL as a sex symbol. And we had not had that in rap. And I can't tell you who I thought was a sex symbol because none of them thought. I'm a man. They didn't. I don't look at men and were attracted to them or anything like that. I think what was interesting though was the responses. And when you have a song like "I Need Love" on your album, it's going to change things. And LL, his record label Def Jam, they all leaned into that. And I'm not saying he was a heartthrob, with his shirt off on the cover of his second album. Quite the contrary, he wasn't. But at that particular time, LL was starting on his dominant run in rap. And, you don't have to like LL, you don't have to love LL, but LL's place in history is cemented. And it all started in 1987 when he took up the charts, and he was, like I said, in my opinion, he was at the apex. Now, from apex rappers, let's get into essential albums from 1987. I've got a few. One, Kool Moe Dee's "How You Like Me Now." I really enjoyed this album. I really, really enjoyed this album. I bought the tape, and Kool Moe Dee kind of portrayed himself as an educated rapper. Like he wasn't he wasn't the street guy, he wasn't the hood guy. He was a guy who, I think he graduated from like community college or something like that. He interviewed, he spoke very well and articulated his points across to people and things of that nature. But "How You Like Me Now" was a very good album. I think was Wild Wild West. I think Wild Wild West was on there without looking it up. And of course, he famously had a beef and battle with LL Cool J. On the title track, "How You Like Me Now," he said, "I'm bigger and better, forget about Deffer." And people took that as a diss. And LL came back and dissed him. And they went back and forth and dissed each other several times for a couple of years on wax. And it always stayed on wax. It never spilled out into the streets. But yeah, I think that was an essential album to get in 1987. Another essential album to get was "Saturday Night," the album by none other than the aforementioned Schoolie D. I don't think I bought this album. I think I if I'm not mistaken, I copped the dub from my boy Jay Fresh. And I played the hell out of this tape. I literally played this tape until it popped. And um it was just a fun listen. I haven't heard it in a while, but in 87 in my tape deck, it got a lot of run. It got a lot of run. If you haven't heard Saturday Night the album from Schoolie D, please go check it out. Schoolie D doesn't get talked about in hip hop circles as much as he should, and he really, really should. Next up, Rhyme Pays from my boy Ice-T. Another dope album. I think one of the things that moved me to this album, again, shout out to Jay Fresh because he bought the tape and he dubbed it for me. One of the things that moved me to this album was just the reality and the rawness of it. Ice-T didn't hold any punches. He came right at you with his rhymes. And again, being from LA, he spoke on things, spoke on, gang culture and things of that nature. And so it was, for lack of a better term, refreshing because it was something totally different. It was totally different from what we were used to hearing. And that was another tape that got a lot of run in my tape deck. Shout out to the great Ice-T. And last but not least, as far as essential albums that you had to get in 1987, Living Large by none other than Heavy D and the Boys. If you follow me, if you follow podcasts, you know that Heavy D is one of my favorites. He's the first artist that I ever saw in concert. He came to my hometown of Florence, South Carolina, and performed at my high school, Wilson High School. And so there's always going to be a level of love and appreciation for Hev. Literally been a Heavy D fan since day one, and this album is why. I played Mr. Big Stuff, Nike, The Overweight Lovers in the House, all of the songs that was on that album. I played it all the time. And I still go back to it from time to time, man, because again, I'm a fan of Hebs. And Heavy D we know he didn't curse on his records, but he was somebody who you literally could play his music for anybody, around anybody, and you'd get it. And again, not a lot of cussing and anything like that. But he got his points across. And Living Large was definitely a fitting title for the young Dwight Myers at the time. All right, so now we're going to move on to the certified classics. Now, let me preface this by saying that if you know me, we don't throw the word classic around, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say all of these albums that I'm about to mention in some way, shape, or form are classics. The aforementioned Born to Mac by Too Short. Propelled by the song Freaky Tales. Again, for me, I love this album. This album is only 8 tracks long, which is kind of wild when you think about it. But yet it's 51 minutes long. It was released July 20th, 1987. Obviously, Freaky Tales was the main, the biggest record on that. And I think that album went gold, selling 500,000 copies. And the record sales don't mean that makes it a classic, because we didn't care about record album sales. And I'll be honest, I never knew what any of those albums sold at that particular time, because nobody kept up with that kind of stuff. I'll be honest. And I say this as someone who was outside. Record sales and how much albums sold was something that really became popularized probably towards the mid to late 90s into the 2000s. Up until that point, we didn't care. But definitely a certified classic. And these are in no particular order. The next one that I have down as a classic, Yo, Bum Rush the Show from Public Enemy. This album was released in March of 1987. Total runtime of 46 minutes and 44 seconds. Some of my favorite tracks on there, Public Enemy #1, Too Much Posse, Sophisticated Bitch, My Uzi Weighs a Gun. I mean, my Uzi weighs a ton, my bad. But yeah, I just love this. This album was a precursor to one of the greatest albums I think that was ever made from Public Enemy. And again, it never gets old. For me, it never gets old. Shout out to Chuck D, Flavor Flav, Professor Griff, Terminator X, and the S1Ws. Incredible, incredible work. And can't forget about the Bomb Squad, the production team. Shout out to them as well. The next album that I would deem a classic would be the aforementioned Bigger and Deffer Bad by LL Cool J. Released May 29th of 1987. Had the hits I'm Bad, Candy, which is a nasty, nasty joint, but I love it. Of course, I Need Love, the Doo-Wop, 357, Break It On Down, and my personal favorite, Go Cut Creator Go. Shout out, rest in peace to E-Love. If you follow the podcast, you know that my boy E Collective was on here last year at the time of this recording, and we did a breakdown of this album. If you didn't have that episode, please go back and listen to it. Dope episode. And I'm not just saying it just because me and E Collective were on it, but me and E Collective were on it. And we broke it down. Next up, another certified classic from 1987, and that would be, again, the aforementioned debut album from Boogie Down Productions called Criminal Minded, released in May of 1987. Total runtime of 51 minutes and 43 seconds. And that had the hits like South Bronx, The Bridge Is Over, Dope Beat, 9mm Goes Bang, just to name a few. Criminal Minded, the title track, and Super Ho. Shout out to the late great Scott LaRock. What can I say about this album? I've already done a breakdown on it, but this album, I personally think it's up there with the all-time greats. Where you put it in the all-time greats is really doesn't matter to me, but I think it's worthy of being there. This was one of those ones. And ironically, when you think about it, for me, it's more about the rapping than it is anything else, where nowadays when you hear people talk about rap or hip hop, they talk about the beats and stuff. The beats were very simple. I mean, like, you listen to something like The Bridge Is Over and it's don't. I mean, that's me, or you could play that on the piano. In fact, we should play that on the piano. But, you know, Chris KRS-One's rhymes, along with, Scott LaRock, it was just incredible, man. And I mean, like, that album, I personally think is a top 10, top 5 album of all time in hip hop. Definitely a classic. And last but not least, when we're talking about classics from 1987, I would be remiss if I did not mention, again, the album that I think, and a lot of people agree, is the greatest album in hip hop history. And that would be none other than Paid in Full from Eric B. and Rakim. Again, that album was released July 7th, 1987. Incredible album, phenomenal album with hits like I Ain't No Joke, I Know You Got Soul, the title track Paid in Full, Move the Crowd, Eric B. as President, the Chinese Arithmetic, which I love and Eclectic does not like. But man, this album, again, it's the best. I don't, where you place it, I don't care. Personally, I think it's the greatest hip hop album ever. I'm willing to have a discussion about what else that you might think is the greatest hip hop album ever. And I'm going to tell you that this is better. But ultimately, I think as we close out the episode, I think 1987 is one of the top 12 years in hip hop. I have it at 11 because although all of these albums are great, I think what you're going to see is as we go down the list, There are some years that are a little bit stronger. Now, 1987, I ain't gonna hold you, is very top heavy. All of the albums that I mentioned on this episode are incredible, phenomenal arts of work. Where it gets tricky for 1987 is as you go down, you have an apex of albums, which we discussed on the podcast, but the fall off from, 7, 8, 9, 10 on down, that's where it gets a little tricky when you compare it to other years. But I'm willing to have a conversation if you think 1987 should be higher. You tell me what you think. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it for me. Thanks again for checking out this edition of the Rap Soul Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. We drop new episodes every Thursday. And also, don't forget about the flagship station. That is none other than the 12 Kyle Podcast. And we drop new episodes there every Thursday as well. You can find the 12 Kyle Podcast wherever you're listening or watching this podcast as well. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it for me. I am your boy 12 Kyle. I will catch you guys next time. 5,000. Cheers.
Welcome to the Rap Soul Podcast, where we dive deep into the world of music that moves our hearts and gets our feet tapping. This is the intersection of rap and soul music from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. We appreciate you for listening. Share this podcast with a friend or family member who loves music as much as you do. The podcast is hosted by 12 Kyle. Next up, the Rap Soul Podcast.